The night was quiet until the engines came. Not storms, not thunder, but heavy planes cutting through the sky. One after another, they landed on secret runways in Ukraine. There were no crowds to welcome them, no speeches, no cameras, only fog, bright runway lights, and the hiss of ramps lowering to the ground. In just 3 days, everything changed. Moscow felt like a sudden strike where it was least prepared. Europe felt the warning too, carried on the wings of these planes. Something had arrived, powerful, silent, and impossible to ignore. The world did not watch this landing in real time. There were no breaking news alerts or live streams, but in Ukraine, people close to the runways heard the roar. One after another, giant U.S. cargo planes touched down without pause. Each arrival was quick. Engines stayed on, ramps lowered, and trucks rolled forward to collect the load. Then the planes lifted off again, leaving the ground crew to work in silence. What made it unusual was not only the number of aircraft, but also the speed. 27 planes in 72 hours meant an endless stream of heavy transport. It was not the kind of support that drips slowly across weeks. It was concentrated. It was planned to happen before anyone could react. Those watching from afar only noticed once it was already finished. By the time images spread through defense circles, the equipment was in position and the planes were gone. The quiet rhythm of this operation carried its message. The U.S. could act directly inside Ukraine, and it did not need to announce it. For Ukraine, the arrival meant relief. Weapons and gear did not have to wait at distant borders or risk long convoys under attack. Supplies were now landing inside the country itself. For Russia, the picture was darker. The idea that Ukraine was isolated was no longer true. America had landed its steel wings in the middle of the battlefield, fast and unchallenged. The landings did more than bring cargo. They showed intent. They proved that Washington could move with speed and secrecy, and that even deep inside a war zone, the runways were no longer empty. They were alive, and every arrival carried a warning that the war had entered a new phase. In Moscow, the reaction was sharp but quiet. Russian commanders realized that such a large movement of planes had entered Ukraine without their notice. For years, they had claimed control over the tempo of this war. Now, in just 3 days, that claim was shaken. It was not only about weapons arriving, it was about surprise. The U.S. had shown it could cross into what Russia believed was secure space and leave again before alarms were raised. This sudden shock forced Russian leaders to rethink their position. If cargo planes could arrive without warning, then perhaps their defenses were more fragile than they had admitted. For the Kremlin, it was not a loss of land but of confidence. Their blind spot had been exposed, and everyone could see it. Across Europe, the mood was mixed. In Berlin, leaders welcomed the move. They saw it as proof that the U.S. was ready to take action rather than simply talk. German officials stressed that Moscow must be contained, and this was a step toward that goal. In London, the reaction was even stronger. British officials praised Washington for leading when Europe itself had hesitated. They framed it as the kind of boldness the continent had been waiting for. Paris, however, struck a different note. French leaders warned of danger in moving too quickly. They argued that the more forces appeared inside Ukraine, the greater the chance of miscalculation. A single mistake could open an escalation path that would be hard to close. President Macron, in his speech, reminded allies that diplomacy was still necessary even when weapons were flowing. Beyond these capitals, smaller states in Eastern Europe felt both relief and unease. Relief because U.S. support made their borders feel less exposed. Unease because the shadow of a larger war was creeping closer. The landings had not just changed the battlefield in Ukraine, they had shifted the balance of thought across Europe. Some saw hope in American speed. Others saw risk in its silence, but none could ignore the fact that the war was no longer distant. It was now at their door. The question everyone asked after the landings was the same. What exactly came off those planes? Analysts studied flight paths, timing, and the scale of the operation. They concluded that this was not a routine resupply. The cargo likely included advanced artillery shells, guided rockets, mobile radar units, encrypted radios, and field medical stations. Each item had a clear role. Together, they formed a package designed not just to hold the line, but to change it. Long-range guided shells could strike with accuracy, reaching targets far behind Russian positions. Mobile radar systems could scan the skies for drones and missiles, giving defenders more time to respond. Secure communication tools would allow units to coordinate under fire without Russian interception. Even the medical units carried meaning. They suggested a plan to support soldiers closer to the front, reducing the time between injury and care. This mix of equipment pointed to something larger. It was not simply about defense. It gave Ukraine the ability to strike deeper, move faster, and survive longer. The timing mattered too. Delivering so much in such a short window suggested Washington was preparing Kiev for a new phase of fighting. Not just patching holes. But hardware was only part of the story. Quiet rumors spread that American special forces might have traveled with the cargo. Small groups, unseen, moving without insignias. Their role would not be to fight directly, but to train, guide, and secure. They could help set up the advanced systems, pass along intelligence, and keep sensitive equipment safe. In past conflicts, such hidden deployments shaped the outcome in ways the public rarely noticed. If they were now in Ukraine, it meant U.S. involvement had reached another level. Not official, not declared, but real. Whether or not the rumors were true, the suggestion alone carried weight. It told both allies and enemies that the American presence might go further than announced. And in war, perception is often as powerful as fact. The cargo held weapons, but the shadows hinted at something even more unsettling. Quiet hands shaping the battlefield from within. The planes did not land in public airports. They touched down on hidden strips deep inside Ukraine. These runways were not built overnight. Weeks of preparation went into them. Fuel tanks, mobile control towers, radar points, and security units were set up quietly. By the time the first C-17 arrived, the network was ready. The secrecy was part of the strategy. Open runways can be tracked by satellites and struck from afar. But scattered airstrips, surrounded by fields and forests, are harder to find. Some were shielded by mobile air defenses, possibly American-made, while others relied on quick reaction forces on the ground. The result was simple. Any threat that came near these sites would face resistance from both the sky and the earth. This design showed that the U.S. was not treating these stops as temporary. They looked more like long-term nodes. Each one acted as a hub where supplies could land, spread quickly to the front, and stay safe from sudden attacks. For Ukraine, it meant faster movement of weapons, fewer delays at borders, and less chance of convoys being hit before reaching the battlefield. For Washington, the message was different, but just as strong. The U.S. had crossed from distant support into direct presence. Supplies were no longer just flowing across NATO borders. They were being delivered inside Ukraine itself. That shift carried weight. It was not just about moving crates. It was about showing that America could plant part of its structure inside the war zone. The strategy was clear. Instead of reacting slowly, the U.S. was building a system that could keep the war effort supplied with speed and resilience. And once such a system exists, it rarely disappears. The impact of the landings spread far beyond Ukraine. Inside NATO, leaders spoke quickly. Germany called it a necessary step to stop Russian aggression. Britain praised Washington for taking action when hesitation had lasted too long. Both countries framed it as a strength, as proof that the alliance could move together. France, however, struck a cautious tone. Paris warned that too much direct presence inside Ukraine could trigger mistakes. One wrong move, one misread signal, and the conflict could expand beyond control. French officials pushed again for talks, reminding everyone that even in war, communication can prevent disaster. At the United Nations, debate grew louder. Some nations that had stayed neutral until now voiced concern. They feared that contested ground might turn into a stage for global powers. Moscow, meanwhile, chose silence. No speech, no threat, only quiet. And in that quiet, pressure began to grow. Ukraine no longer feels like a buffer. It is turning into the center of a new front line. Bases are expanding, drills are louder, and equipment flows faster than before. Even neutral countries nearby are adjusting, spending more on defense and watching their skies with greater care. But the deeper the presence grows, the harder it becomes to step back. Each new runway, each new system, ties the conflict tighter. The question hangs over every capital. Where is the next red line? And when it is crossed, will anyone be ready to stop what follows?